Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out your Friday evening and joining us this Friday, April 29th, 2022. My name is Kali Akuno with the Institute for Social Ecology, and I want to welcome you all to our ongoing series about race and the climate justice movement. Tonight, we have with us a good friend, comrade, brother in the struggle, Ananda Lee Tan, who's joining us. And we, I think, are going to engage in probably a bit of a two-way exchange tonight. But we're going to stay, as true to our regular format as possible. And that is, just so everybody's aware, the kind of a dialogue question between me and Ananda for about 45 minutes. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers for the last 45 minutes. And depending on the size of the group, we can either do it, direct questions, or folks could put questions into the chat feature. For this one in particular, I'd like to encourage folks to look at the chat and also participate in the chat, because we'll probably be referencing a number of different documents and organizations, and be kind of throwing that in just to make sure that everybody's familiar with it. And if you're not, that you have the stuff as a resource and can go home and do your homework, and dig in the crates, as we would say, to kind of explore some of the stuff a little bit deeper. I'm not going to just kind of get straight into it, in this conversation tonight, because I think it's going to be rich. And the fundamental piece that I really wanted us to hone in on in this discussion is, in the midst of all the current science reports, really not the last 2 years, but everything that's come out this first 4 months has clearly indicated that by any metric that you could analyze, we are definitely way beyond all the pressure points, and we are at a critical inflection, with the climate and with the world's overall ecological systems. We're hitting, targets, if you would, or points of analysis that many didn't expect for like another 50 years if things had kind of occurred at the rate they were, when a lot of this started being measured in the 1990s. And we are already there in many, really respects past that, in terms of, just look at the average global temperature, now. Way beyond the 1.5, really way beyond the 2.0 targets. And this is being put out, a lot of it being put out, by the UN's top scientists. Some of the most credible and far-reaching points of analysis have come out this year. And it's as if the governments of the world are just totally oblivious and ignoring all of what's staring us right in the face. But then more importantly, our movements are not responding, right? In my view, not responding with the urgency and, dare I say, desperation that the situation requires. And so I wanted to bring Ananda on, who I go to in many respects to kind of understand a lot of these questions and a lot of the movements of the different sectors, a lot of the political movements and the strategic thinking of a lot of the different forces within our movement and within the philanthropy sectors that influence our movement, how and why different sectors are doing what they're doing and thinking what they're thinking. And I just really wanted to ask Ananda, like, what in the hell is going on? Like, why is the movement so dormant? Why is it not really stepping up to the moment? Why aren't we meeting the moment? So that's the fundamental question to start off with. There's things to go underneath that and kind of unpack within that. But that's my question, Ananda. Let's start with that. In your view, why are we so lethargic in this period in time?
Wow. I mean, that is, the more I think about it, Kali, that is a question for us to unpack in order for us to even start building anew or coming up with fresh strategies. But really, I've been looking at an alarming array of evidence that's come up in terms of the role of philanthrocapitalism. And that's one thing I want to put a pin in it for now, but I think we should come back to it. Really, what is the role of philanthrocapitalism capitalism in stifling movements? We all talk about the nonprofit industrial complex, but what is its complicity being with some of the largest philanthropists in the world who have their own agenda that they've thought for the last 2 decades that they could outflank the nation state negotiations at the UN to come up with their own layer of thinking. And we can talk about its collusion with neoliberalism at that, I think the trade policy level, if you will. But before we get to that, I think there's another examination of what's actually happened to our movements. Where have we built muscle? And I think that's a bigger conversation. I'd love to come back with you in terms of where do we need to build the muscle of, like we were talking about, our future generations' capacity to fight together, to struggle together, to build together, to stop together, to think together, to really look at the place-based solutions and strategies that we need. So, but if we wind it back a bit, I think when going back to the IPCC, the UN, the latest reports, yes, the numbers are in. One thing I wanted to kind of note is that you recently had a conversation with Tom, and I was inquiring about that. Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network, who's a mentor to me, and whose instruction I follow in terms of his observations in global policy arenas. And one of the things that I've noted is, for the first time in a long time, I've sensed an urgency. IEN put out a note saying, hey, there's a key piece to what the scientific assessment is at this stage, and that is that there is an impact. There's numbers associated. There's numbers in terms of the numbers of people who are going to die on the front lines of the storms, the floods, the fires, the droughts, the cultural, genocide that's happening associated with that, the militarization and the wars associated with the complex that's causing climate change. That I've seen before. I mean, I've always noted a duality, cultural duality in the world of big white NGOs, the international set, the World Wildlife Funds, climate action networks, the big, the moneyed NGOs who are at these neoliberal policy tables, brokering, false neoliberal solutions that we should also talk about later, and the grassroots leadership, where it's like, okay, we've got a different scale that we're dealing with when you come to colonization and the struggle of indigenous communities around the world. And as we know, so that's, I've noted that to be a difference in how our urgency around the carbon metrics has been expressed. But the fact is that now we can, there's death by carbon as there is death by every toxic pollutant, co-pollutant out there, or by all the other systems that we need to examine first before we even think of decarbonization. That is becoming very clear, and it is Black, Brown, Indigenous, migrant, and poor communities on the front lines of those numbers. If we look at COVID, the last 2 years has been a lesson on what environmental justice looks like when you look at the deaths and the disproportionate burdens and impacts faced across communities of color internationally. It's really tied a threat to, I've witnessed probably more people die from Indian cities than I have in years previous, and just because of the high pollution rates there. But yes, bringing it back to what I'd say in brief, the two big areas I'd explore are where has our pedagogy, where does it need to be beefed up, where do we need to lean into? I think we've created a lot of strong we've provided some strong ideological, I think, guidance to young. I think we need to introduce more rigor on that side, but there's a piece around praxis. I think on that trip to Scotland, we missed you there, Kali, but that would have been a great place to talk about it. What I witnessed coming back, we've got some brilliant young leaders, but who we haven't taught enough direct action, real deep direct action capacity to. And the direct action world that's been funded by the nonprofit complex, again, for further discussion, has been very stifled in cookie cutter training manuals that have taught some young people how to disrupt, but not how to follow through with a deep democratic the commitment to deep democracy and local self-determination, that the organizing of it and the fighting and protecting space for it, that I think I see you all as being on the cutting edge of at Co-op Jackson. So, sorry, that was a long-winded response, but those are the kind of buckets of why. Why is there not a movement responding to this moment? Query.
Well, I mean, I want to follow up and now on that in terms of looking at philanthropy's role in this, right? And really point out one in particular, a new player on the field, and that's Jeff Bezos, right? And what he's thinking and doing. And let's just, I think name up front in spirit of healthy debate, exchange, and the unity struggle, unity process, how tricky his entry into the field and introduction in that level of introduction of kind of capital into the movement, how disruptive it's been, I think at this particular point in time. And how do we distinguish, first and foremost, like his stated aims and objectives, with the aim and objectives that have been articulated as part of the fund that he's putting out. Now, what do I mean, just for everybody to be clear? One of the things that Jeff Bezos said to me, I think, really kind of sums up, I think, the deep contradictions of this approach, right? His approach in particular. When he made his little foray into space, he made some comments that one of the critical things that he wants to do is create, by implication, a whole super automated system of production that is done off-world, presumably on the moon, or perhaps with his class buddy, Elon Musk, somewhere on Mars. And he said very explicitly, I want to take all the polluting industries, right, and move them into space so we can save the pearl and the gem that is the earth. Now, many people, and I saw some sectors of what I would call like the big green, were supportive of that, but there was no I didn't see much of a critical analysis, and unfortunately, I really wanted to dig into it and go after, but was not well and didn't have the time enough to do it. But the implications of that, one of which parts of it was the eugenic framework that's kind of very explicitly embedded and underscored in what he was saying, and like who gets to make the decision as to what production methods are employed to do anything, and where it should be housed, and how it should be functioning and cared for. And then the other deep kind of paternalistic side, okay, so you move all the production off world. How are we going to eat? Right? Where's the farming? Where's the food going to come from? How is this going to be managed, and by whom?
I think Bill Gates is taking care of that equation in his drive to buy up all the farmland on behalf of Monsanto, right?
And that's the other thing that Jeff Bezos is also in that. He's one of the largest landowners in the United States. So how do we reconcile this, like this major introduction of capital that he is now like nesting into the movement?
Yeah.
So if you can give me your sense.
Sure.
Why now? Like for forces like him, why now? Why this, as opposed to so many other things he can do, and how is this tied to like this kind of broader narrative of the corporations and their view of the world?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's at the core of it. Like, what is our understanding of disaster capital? And I mean, that's really at the crux of this new emergent strategy in their world, which is let's take this experiment to where we can extract next. There used to be when we were fighting the multinational corporations destroying the forests up in these parts of the Pacific Northwest, there used to be kind of one of those right-wing response to Earth First was Earth first, the other planets later, which showed a logger who had taken down every tree on the planet. And that was kind of that was funded by the same people who are probably now shilling for the oil and gas industries and promoting nature-based solutions or what have you. But it is a cusp, but Bezos is definitely leading the charge. I mean, I've been looking at it as Bezos's billions are wreaking havoc, are actually fracturing our movements right now in the negotiation of who gets what money in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion dollars, or in the name of justice, Justice 40. It is a very dangerous space of negotiation that, if it weren't for the fact that so many communities of color saved Biden's ass in the last election, we wouldn't actually probably be on the cusp of being able to even challenge that. I think what got us an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, what got us key appointments in the recent years is also kind of that line of negotiation where is it going to be a facade? Is this all going to be token? Where is the money going? And when you look at his first $7 billion and the way Bezos, the Earth Fund laid it out, I mean, right off the top, it was clear that 6 of the 7 billion are going to be purposed towards a false set of solutions, being that big green groups and the oil and gas industry and the American Chemistry Council and all the industry lobby groups are negotiating at that level. Even at the IPCC, the way this report was written, and this is what I always tell people, like, as long as science is bought and paid for by the billionaire class, the true oligarchy, that we're not even creating the right framework of examining this problem. That's been the challenge with IPCC, is driving an examination of technocratic solutions, whether they're on the moon or whether it's deep in the ground and pushing carbon capture and sequestration facilities through all kinds of bogus, unproven, measures. I mean, as someone who's fought some of the most ludicrous technology proposals in the field of incineration and energy generation, I can tell you, we're watching stuff that makes chemtrails look like, really poorly written sci-fi. The complexity of what's coming at us in terms of geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, soil, ocean fertilization, cloud seeding. Some of the stuff is just insane, but that's that cutting edge that Bezos and Musk are really pushing us to. This kind of a very dystopian kind of futurism, which is all about it's still rooted in patriarchy, it's still rooted in white supremacy, still rooted in the harm is intentional, shall we say, the racialized harm you talk about. It is, there is a eugenic sort of a agenda there, identifying that and identifying how the ongoing extraction, negotiation of resources from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere in the world is really rooted in that kind of in that ongoing, I guess, that order. I mean, I'm someone who likes to think, okay, well, where can we engage and disrupt or intervene? And definitely, one thing that I try to stress in our movements is that if we want a strong parallel analysis of the folks who are destroying the earth, the Bezos, the Musks, and the billionaire class and their various industries, the war and fossil fuel and other industries, extractive industries, we need to actually have a strong analysis of the people they are paying to keep our voices stifled, to the nonprofit class that is colluding with us, that provides a barrier, that was intentionally funded so that climate marches could happen outside every UN space, but in a safe, controlled, and measured way where they were never impactful. And our role, what is our role in that space to then go challenge and contest? And I've never believed in inside-outside strategies when it comes to a global complex of colonial nation states. But even if we want to get non-state leadership in this space, how do we turn the inside out? How do we, and that's where I'm curious about. I've always seen municipalist strategies as being the alternative form where we throw down in line with what you all are doing, but what you've been trying to do in that whole fearless cities world of creating trans-local political alignment, that because I think we need to build those spaces while we're trying to actually, disrupt and eventually dismantle the colonial nation state status of the UN, I guess. I'll put in here a link to Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which was, as you know, how many of our movements folks came together to really define what are the false solutions that the Bezos Musk class of folks are promoting and have been promoting for at least the better part of the last 20 years, from carbon markets to geoengineering to nuclear power, new marketing for a lot of old bad stuff like nuclear power technologies and waste incinerators, and then of course the whole host of newfangled technologies that they're trying to peddle. But in it, one of the issues that is really fascinating is how they are greenwashing and co-opting our language, at a rate faster than the nonprofit complex can pay us to produce. So terms like regenerative economy, just transition, even environmental justice, they're trying to co-op and buy out in many ways. And that's kind of, I think, the cutting edge of where we need to kind of train up our young organizers to really understand how to be critical of that, that nonsense coming at them.
Yeah. A lot of work to do there. They're definitely speeding some things up, the one piece that I found most stunning, since this inter-imperialist rivalry, jumped off in the Ukraine, is how this very conversation is being transformed. So on the one hand, they are definitely, when I say they, I'm talking, let's make it specific about the Biden administration. There are other players, but the Biden administration doubling down on expanding and ramping up extractive oil production to new heights, right? To really kind of offset, quote unquote, the global shortage and the global disruption in the supply chain coming as a result of both their sanctions and the actual disruptions in production, both in the Ukraine and Russia. But preaching them, folks in Germany in particular, the Biden administration and the Social Democrats and the Greens in Germany, who are kind of presently at the helm of that nation state, really trying to double down and talk about, well, we need energy independence. They've adopted that phrase, which is a right-wing phrase in its origin derivation, so everybody's clear about that. But both of them have been articulating this, like, we need more drilling for unspecified amount, but greater investment, in green technology, or at least what they're calling like green technology. But what's not being really clearly, analyzed and discussed, that I think we have to do a piece on. This one, I'm linking it to a piece around you talking about the education. One of the things I see that's missing in so many of our movements right now amongst young people, there's a critical kind of internationalism which is just not there. It's absent, right? And a knowledge of it on a deep sense. And why am I saying that? Because even before this jumped off, the European Union had already, articulated its own Belt and Road program to counter China's Belt and Road initiative. And guess what that was fundamentally centered upon, right? It's fundamentally centered upon the recolonization of Africa and its natural resources. Absolutely. With France being a leading component and the leading source of that. And why is that so particular? Because France fundamentally, not uniformly, but it still has a tight colonial grip over large sections of West Africa. And what we saw and did not get the same kind of fanfare or coverage or concern was a whole swath of coups d'etats in Africa, but particularly in West Africa in 2021. And the underscoring piece of that, some of it which was just out in the obvious, open and obvious, is about reestablishing relations in this global, competition for resources, for markets, and by resources I mean, you get all these sovereign wealth funds in particular buying up almost all of the fertile land that still exists in large parts of Africa that aren't already owned, or privatizing more of it, or just sweeping people off the market. And that's not just European countries. That's South Korea, that's Singapore, that's China, that's Japan. All of them deeply involved in this kind of recolonizing project in Africa, in the midst of this hardcore expansion on the part of the U.S. In this new African Strategic Command, or AFRICOM, to really challenge and rival what the Chinese are doing and how they have been approaching this question of extracting resources from the African continent. So the buildup to part of what happened in Ukraine, I would argue to everybody, we saw some of its precursors play out in 2021 in the field in Africa, right? Where these major deep resource wars had already started ramping up. And you have different forces and different factions, of folks trying to control the state apparatus and these pieces, trying to figure out, well, should we side with the Chinese or should we side with the US and the EU? Who's going to give us the better deal? Who's going to give us the better term? How can we then extract ourselves favorable pieces out of it? But now this whole search that's going on that we're hearing completely justified and completely rationalized in the context of the war in Ukraine is this is a necessity for the globe now, right? But at whose expense?
That's right.
Right, at whose expense? Like, where are the new oil lines and the new drilling lines and the new pipeline? Where's all this going to be built to feed Western Europe? Like, where is it coming in? So they talked about doing the liquefied gas thing and stepping it up. That's not a form of energy right now that Europe uses. So they're going to have to offset, what they don't have by exploring and developing up capacity already. And what I haven't seen, like I'm trying to bring up points of the points of connection.
Totally.
I see very few folks
we're not,
or anything in between be concerned in any regard, either from an anti-war perspective or a perspective of supporting NATO and the US, like really bring up like, well, at whose expense are all these new developments going to come?
And this is something I actually even look in our movements. I oftentimes have blamed the vanguard left for avoiding this very question on assessing the colonial resource wars. As I kind of like, you're spot on. I mean, we should have been like, I mean, how we view the UN should be instructed about how the members of the UN were gradually let in over the years to participate in essentially, a very white supremacist European colonial framework of global governance. That where the independence of nation states like India having, like my coming of age within India was always asking the Students' Federation of India, it's like, well, shouldn't we be questioning like a whole other system where, I mean, even the left bought into this model of production and development and export that was just carrying on what the British East India Company had started, 400 years ago, right? It's like, someone pointed out to me recently, because there's this discussion around mass transit. How do we push back on EVs and, the Elon Musk world of electrifying everything to actually looking at how do we address mass transit? And someone said, but you know what? If you look at the rail lines and how they were structured to serve empire, it forces us to think, how can you then lay rail that relocalizes economies into place-based democratic self-governance, right? And like, what is the decolonization of rail? It's it's like, and whether even there's a path down that road of investments, because that's where our minds go to in terms of single-family vehicles to rail. How do we stop digging the ground for all metals, not just fossil fuels, and actually look at the junkyards that are out there that kind of reshape our thinking of what our communities really need? It forces, I think, the decolonization lens to look actually even deeper into what even in our movements we've sometimes been taught to depend on in terms of the tools and the boxes of the master class, right? It's like, it's that. So I think that's probably one of the most critical conversations our movements need to be having is like, what is the current state of play in these colonial resource wars? Where is it that we need to be ready to step in when they're, like Musk and his ilk think they can force another coup? I think when Morales was unseated, my first call was like, isn't it obvious it's German lithium companies? And a lot of my folks were like, no, we can't. Even Pablo Solon and others were not willing to come out clearly and say that. It was complicated, but it was so obvious that at the bottom of it, like, who was benefiting. And so it was no surprise that when Evo got back that, I mean, that was a negotiation, whatever his role was, he was losing, where he was being forced to give at least 80% to these German mining corporations, and where he was losing confidence amongst his own base, perhaps. But those are the real conversations I think we need to have. Is like, where do we lean in, take a stand? And when I think of on Turtle Island here in so-called North America, where we have been most successful at fighting these empires has been on those extraction fronts. Standing Rock is emblematic of, a few dozen struggles going on all across the landscape. And right here in my backyard, the two biggest pipelines, Kinder Morgan, and then an LNG pipeline up north, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, were basically going into billion-dollar cost overruns that the Canadian government couldn't afford until this war broke out. And now the pipelines are back on the table. The price of oil is to me, it's always been about, following the money.
Okay.
To determine where we put in our fight to kind of stop it. Like, because now we're having a few strategy sessions in the coming weeks on how do we realign to stand in solidarity with the limited resources the grassroots have to stop these pipelines, because the bulldozers are back out there.
So say more if you can on that. So folks who might be looking at this on video, and many will afterwards, who are not familiar with the Wet'suwet'en struggle at all, right? And I'm glad you brought that up, because I did notice something in the email chain that indicated that it was back on, and I was like, wait a minute, I thought we had defeated that.
Yeah,
but I didn't make the connection until you just said it right now, Ananda. That this recent resurge in oil prices, in Canada being one of the world's leading producers of oil, for those who may not know, that's just a new infusion of cash. So now it makes sense, right? Okay, now and the same thing we're seeing here in the United States, like Biden, releasing a good percentage of the strategic reserve, and rolling out a whole new set of incentives for production expansion in the midst of all this, even though they're doing all this talk about this is about bringing the price down, right, for political advantage, for the midterm elections in particular. But they're having a boom. I mean, they're recording record profit, record earnings, like across the board in a lot of these corporations, even while they're many sectors are complaining about the cost of labor and the production costs. Like, you can't explain that with these record-breaking, profit-making costs. Totally. So, but if you can, just speak a little bit about what that is and why it's important, like internationally, like, and what are the role of the tar sands and that kind of whole piece in the global kind of extractive layout.
Yeah, no, about 15, 16 years ago, I was talking to policy analysts for the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, who represent the energy sector workers up here, and who had been they're one of the militant left unions that broke off from some of the internationals, and, some of our old Trotskyists, I guess I'd say, from back in the day. And the guy said, there's this term, a World Bank term called a Dutch disease. And I was, what's that? Dutch elm disease? Is that tree disease? And he was like, no, it was this phenomenon back in the 70s where the Dutch government invested so much in offshore oil and gas drilling that it bumped up the price of the guilder so high that it crashed their export commodities market. It basically, what they relied on in terms of the money they made off their exchange rates, what just killed a lot of the export economy. And interestingly enough, it was just around that time, about 15 years ago, the investment in the tar sands killed the forest products economy in Canada, which is the biggest cross-border commodity trade in the world of lumber, softwood lumber that goes from Canadian forests into US mills and bank accounts. But it killed that industry, which relied on that 25% difference between the value of the Canadian dollar and the US dollar. And when the price of oil hit $100 per barrel, the Canadian dollar became stronger for the first time in 40 or 50 years than the US dollar since World War II. It was this phenomenon that took place that laid off a whole bunch of people. The other half of the CEP's membership that was in the pulp mills actually got laid off, and they were like, shit, what happened? And there was this forecasting of how oil and gas investments disrupt kind of broader economies, or any vertically integrated industry that's so big it comes in and kills the prospects for all industries that are not as vertically integrated, not playing in their league, if you will. That's the way I understand it. Now, we not too long ago, I think it was a year and a half ago, we watched the oil and gas industry hit lows like it's never experienced before. I think they were like negative, rates and
They were
their
giving it
value
away in early 2020, literally
Oh,
giving it away.
oh man, there was the pandemic showed us a lot, in terms of the weaknesses of empire and also the vulnerabilities. There was like over 120,000 oil and gas sectors laid off across the US. So there was a negotiation that happened. And I'm not in the upper echelons of the AFL-CIO or any of those folks. And they have a lot of the leadership of, once, so-called movements, I think needs to be called into question right now. Why are they supporting false solutions that are clear subsidies that are propping up these oil and gas industries? So I think therein lies our answer. The UNFCCC, I think, provided a basis for, even before we get to war, for the Biden administrations and the Trudeau governments and others to reinvest in oil and gas through other surreptitious ways, like these false solutions, like through carbon capture and storage and biofuels and other ways where the tenure of oil and gas and other extractive industries is allowed to continue, provided they are investing them, or that they are buying into these bogus fantasies of being able to store carbon underground and and other and offset their make small window dressing of forest conservation measures, offsets for massive amounts of pollution in other parts of the world. And so that's a lot of what we were like. So oil and gas hit this all-time low. They were looking to be bailed out. And so when we came back from the UN, the first thing that we noticed was Biden coming back and saying, okay, we can't afford to deny leases in the Gulf Coast. We can't afford to deny leases. I mean, they had to make their compromises and cut their costs, but it was clearly where it was going to be most cost efficient to keep a dinosaur industry propped up. And so what happened between then and the war, I don't know. But regardless of the set of negotiations that were going on, all of a sudden, Trudeau had announced that the federal debt was $20 billion to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. That is something that in Canada, it's not big in the US, but that was way too big to get any kind of public support. So people actually here thought that that pipeline was dead in the water until the war broke out. And again, we see prices jumping up to $100 per barrel. And, the bulldozers come back out. So there's that direct correlation. What people are having to rush to up here is there was a lot of awesome direct action led by the Wet'suwet'en, led by the Tiny House Warriors, led by various direct action formations, some traditional Indigenous leadership, some young warriors stepping up to say, hey, we're going to take a new stance beyond even sometimes band council complicity and collusion, and various forces like in the Salish Seas here. There's quite a strong alliance that's willing to say, hey, we're going to keep fighting this. This is our struggle against empire, the colonial empires that are threatening the seas, threatening the salmon ecosystems, threatening our traditional lands and forests. And now all of a sudden it's like, damn, we got to quickly think about how we train up another 1,000 folks in the art of blockades and direct action and creative, sustainable, long-term, community-rooted, mass direct action, I would say. Sorry, that's a bit of I don't know if that was getting to what you were trying to say, but
it's helpful. I just think that, well, if you could say more about the centrality of the indigenous struggle there, right, and how this is going at many of the kind of active struggles around sovereignty, right, and exposing the contradiction with like the Trudeau government, right, and this on the one hand kind of promising an expansion of dialogue and inclusion and restorative justice around indigenous communities, right, First Nations communities in Canada, but it's totally offset in contradiction by the whole push around making Canada one of if not in essence, his part of his push seems to be to me like he wants to displace the United States in the long term as being the number one producer, right? Or having kind of Canada play that kind of perpetual role in the future.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And how much I think our movements over the last 20, 25 years, I think have been cross-pollinated, particularly from some of the key lessons and generation of struggle coming from Indigenous communities, First Nation communities up in Canada that have crossed the border into the United States, often without people knowing or having knowledge about how some things started up there and then migrated, down here to be a source of inspiration and strength. So if just speaking a little bit about that, because then I think this speaks to like what we were talking about earlier, right? Like the need for an internationalism, if you would. We're still using their nation state framework, but a need for that, like, and why that's so central, why some of that has been cut off. Now, let me interject. Don't lose your thought on that. One of the things I do want to come back and ask Ananda, that we've spent a lot of time here in the U.S. the last, since Biden has been in office, and even a little bit before, really trying to play up, for instance, like a Green New Deal, right? When that's a deep framework that's being kind of used and promoted, on the U.S. side. And for anybody who's cared to pay any attention and look at it, once the Green Party had that framework long before it got popularized. But once AOC kind of popularized it, I was one to say, okay, look, that's not a bad thing, right? But it has to have some clear content to it, and we have to shape the content. Now, I think some aspects of the nonprofit sectors of the movement have done that, but there's still like this push to do it, even though it's very clear Biden and the Democratic Party made it known a long time ago. That's not a framework that we're going to push. And then the framework of the Build Back Better program totally excluded all of our demands, but there was no cost that we extracted for our ongoing support for this party with this framework. And so one of the questions is like, why? When are we going to learn some critical lessons and start moving in a different direction?
Absolutely. No, that's a good point, Kali. And maybe actually, this is interesting because I think you and I we were talking through CJ and other channels at that point about what that opportunity meant when AOC and others came up with the Green New Deal in response to the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion. And it's interesting because even in these very vibrant, youth-led, inspiring direct action movements, there was something a bit off. I mean, it was brilliant the way they took the streets in London. It was brilliant the way they went after the centrist Dems, Pelosi and others. But when remember, I don't know if you remember, when they first presented us the language of the Green New Deal, I was like, do you know what net zero emissions means? I asked one of AOC's aide, and he was like, he didn't actually know. He actually asked us, what do you think if you had applied a critical lens towards market-based mechanisms to this document? What surprise? I said, well, it's in the first sentence right there. Your top tier objective of achieving a net zero emissions, it's a language that the oil and gas companies came up with, and for the last 5 years have been trying to peddle as a new rebranding of carbon markets. Right. We'd effectively, I think, discredited cap and trade systems up to that point and pollution profiteering as yet another smokescreen for climate action, or for the lack of climate action, and a way to make, to keep the oil and gas and polluting industries at the table at that time. So when we contested that, it took another year to actually do some deep education with Sunrise and XR. I mean, I think XR still has it in its international platform, but I think a lot of the locals finally, at least on this side of the water, were like, okay, let's take that out. So we forced it out of the Green New Deal language only last year. So when it was being reintroduced, I think at that point, the hope that maybe, the squad or, all of those folks in the could wrangle some kind of a compromise, post-election compromise out of the DNC. And I don't know, well, I don't think it is obviously, like you said, it hasn't really worked, but it's critical because globally, and I'll put in here an article of we were able to generate, that's where we brought Hoodwinked in the Hothouse and other critical lenses to look at climate false solutions back on the table. And we got at least a lot of the grassroots movements and some of the NGOs to sign on to this platform, Real Solutions, Not Net Zero, shortly after, we actually forced that out of the Green New Deal language. So I think this is significant because I think this is where our movements need to be pushing both the Bezos dollars and the lines of negotiation around what those dollars are intended for. Because if it's in this field of net zero emissions or even drawdown strategy, which is a technocratic strategy come up with, by the technocrats bought and paid for by the industry side, it's not going to meet any goals of justice. Trying to harmonize them will not work. I mean, that was our argument to AOC. It was like, look, you cannot put net zero emissions in the same sentence as just transition, because just transition really is all about the democratic self-determination of communities and workers working together and localized, for place-based solutions, right? And net zero is about allowing the markets to decide how they're going to balance the books, so to speak, in terms of carbon numbers, right? And so how do we? I think more critical filters, because neoliberalism has gone very very cagey and very good at co-opting language. And I'll make a reference back to the other question you asked about the leadership of place-based Indigenous sovereigntist struggle and what that means to our movements, because I do believe that that's probably our strongest place we can lean into here in the Pacific Northwest. The Lummi Nation, south of me, actually, there's a saying their activists have, we're going there to honor some of their veterans in the next couple of months, that Lummi leads, that Lummi has never lost a fight since 1976 against oil and gas and fossil fuel infrastructure. And we need to lean into those places because it is their legacy, their history, the 10,000 year knowledge of where their ancestors are buried on the land, in the water, in the mud flats, depending on their roles as hunters, gatherers, fishermen, is really where they can say, you cannot come over this land. You cannot trespass with your pipelines and your ships and your tankers and your rail lines serving the next design of oil and gas. And that was enshrined in a lot of struggles that I got involved with in the 80s, that eventually the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en struggle, their contestation in the Supreme Courts of Canada, which won the Delgamuukw versus Crown case in the 90s, and established the ground rules for free, prior, and informed consent that eventually, became that negotiating set of rules in the UN, is now being, there's an attempt to kind of buy out those protocols.
Mm-hmm.
Sinopec, all the various, like the extractive colonial forces that we were talking about earlier are now hiring teams, their diversity, equity, and inclusion teams that are specializing in the language of free, prior, and informed consent. Chevron's willing to put about half of the proceeds on the table. So buying out the lines of resistance where they can after they've jailed the most radical leadership or silenced them somehow. I mean, there's a new era of COINTEL. I say the new COINTELPRO is the philanthrocapitalist complex, though. It's no longer, and it's so much more deadly and dangerous when you think at how they're silencing our people with money, with false notions of leaving legacies or what have you, for movements. But actually, and that's where there's an opportunity for us to both hold some of our thought leaders accountable, but also to challenge them and say, okay, if you really want to support communities on the front lines, turn over the thought leadership to them. And where I see the one sparkle of hope I saw at the UN in Glasgow was the first time it actually seemed like the UN was starting to create space. It's going to be contested space because Chevron's throwing money into that space, paying for their leaders to come from frontiers of many extraction. And then we have our leaders in those spaces, but there's still at least an opportunity to say that Indigenous ecological knowledge, not the Eurocentric technocratic science that's bought and paid for by the oil and gas companies, but Indigenous ecological knowledge needs to guide in this moment of crises. And so I think there is an interesting point, and how do we tie that to, the truth keeping on the front lines of the blockades, because they're all about oh, sure, we'll engage you in a nice conversation. It's just as long as we can keep mining over here and exploring over there. And as long as our lines of direct action are working in tandem with those spaces where we can contest their, at least their epistemology, if you will, um, I think will, that to me, that's where the hope lies. I think that's where I look to some of our young minds to come in and go, wow, we've come up with some new swarming techniques that allow us to kind of overcome the machines that are seeking to destroy their lands, whatever it may be. And similarly, on the other side, how do we actually how do we really flip the script? I mean,
Right.
but I'd like to hear from you, because I think, to me, I always turn to municipal strategy, and I think that there's an alignment between land back, and all our municipal efforts to fight fascism, and the gig economy, and multiple lines of defense, and but where does indigenous sovereignty um guide that municipal strategy? I guess, I mean, place-based ecological knowledge for sure, but what do you see the opportunities in dialogue? Where do we need to be building collective muscle
Right.
and deeper political alignment?
We have to do a series on that one within itself. But in short, I'll start with some of our thinking, of what we've been trying to do here in Jackson, right? With the project. So, the grounding of the Peace for the Jackson Kush Plan comes from the basic principles and articulations around the New African Independence Movement. But underneath that, right, is a kind of a principled understanding that every square inch of what is now called the United States is stolen land, right? And is directly the product of genocide. And the only way that you can kind of correct that wrong is through a program of decolonization. Now, that doesn't mean folks have to go back to Europe or something of that nature, but it means developing a different relationship with the land, right? And with the people who have been the stewards of the land, for however many thousands of years. So it's that would require different relations of production as we would understand them. Definitely would not entail commodity production in any form or fashion that we have grown, I wouldn't say grown, we've been forced into these relationships, speaking from the history of the vast majority of my ancestors, literally forced, through enslavement, to be a part of this extractive system and this production system. But if we want to be true about restoring kind of harmony and balance and doing that justice, all these fundamental things we have to change. So our movement was grounded in that kind of knowledge and principle, and it never looked at, and never, I think will look at in principle, for instance, the United States is like a legitimate political actor, right? Or somebody whose authority and positionality is one that we have to respect or admonish. Like, no, this is an illegitimate entity that only exists through its manipulation of violence. Like that is the sole reason why this thing continues to be in place, not because it is espoused some principles of democracy or anything like that, or this Constitution is so great, even though that was stolen as well, good chunks of it. That is so great. It is something that we need to uphold, etc. But then there's the reality of it has that power. We don't. How do we then weaken it? Like, how do we literally undermine it in such a way that we can open up democratic space, that we can create a new kind of culture? And in the here and now, like where are we best placed based? Like a organization that's primarily people of African descent, in a city like Jackson, which is, overwhelmingly Black, over 80% Black. How do we take that kind of history, culture, and understanding and then build a political program that meets the kind of the material, social, political needs, but is also very centered in on ecological restoration, right? Regenerative restoration, understanding that we're trying to, create a new system that will allow our children and great-grandchildren to live, high quality life, right? Like that is the function of it. And one of the critical things that was like, we start where we are. That's the fundamental basis, like from an organizing perspective. Start where you are and build your base, build your support from there. But the critical pieces as to why we really started trying to articulate a broad program around, radical municipalism. It builds on both the anarchists, the communists, and the Black kind of radical notions of this idea. We tried to infuse some elements of all that. But the critical thing that was really key to the organization that I was a part of that really started thinking about that was, in the era that we live in, and what our analysis was that, we don't underestimate the power of the nation state, particularly the United States being, in many respects, still the most powerful amongst them, but also understanding in the kind of the era of neoliberal capitalism, that capital was exercising a great deal of autonomy beyond the confines of the nation state. And that if we, given our positionality now, where there's not a great internationalism, or international movement or international organization of, communists or anarchists or socialists or anything of that nature, how do we start to rebuild kind of these left bases? And since we now live in a world that is dominated by urban settings in terms of population, right? That just happened within our lifetimes, that the vast majority of people now live in cities as opposed to the countryside. How do we use this in such a way that we start to flip the script on capital and cut it off from being able to say, okay, well, you guys form a union here, fine. Okay, do what you want to do. I'll just shift production to India, or I'll just shift something, to the Philippines, or I'll, just shift it somewhere to Johannesburg, or wherever the situation is, right? Like, it has the freedom and leverage in this era to move decisively, move resources on a massive scale, because it's been able to play us off and exploit the various weaknesses and strength. And so the municipal movement was like, okay, we're not going, in this era right now, the left does not have the strength in many places, most places in this world, to have a major impact at the nation state level. Where we think we can have an impact, and where I think where the 2000s were clearly demonstrated, we can have an impact on the municipal level. But how do we build an international movement which is very clear about, hey, we are, to come up with a practical issue, for instance, we are fighting massive gentrification in our community, right? That's being driven by speculative capital that's coming in, and this new technology. In this case, these digital platforms like Airbnb, right? What are the things that we can do to block their rise and growth and development, right? So a place like Barcelona, and I'm citing because of Philly City's connection, we really wanted to connect with them around this to be like, okay, if Barcelona can be one of the leading places that shuts down or put some constraints on the movement of capital to set up and institutionalize things like Airbnb or Uber, like we need to have cities all throughout the world then saying, we're going to take from your example of the policies and practices you set up and then introduce that in Jackson, right? Introduce that in New Orleans, introduce that so they cannot play us off and we cut off their routes for movement. And then that will then, the theory is and was, that would then enable greater space for movements to emerge from the grassroots and then start to develop the democratic habits and practices to be able to build up our collective strength, towards building some things, right? So there's levels and layers of this, and a lot of stuff. ISC is for instance, Murray Bookchin and his thought has been, very central to a lot of the work over the years that the ISC has done. And I would say, for folks who may be new to any of this, read a lot of his works about municipalism, some of the more cutting edge stuff coming out of North America, I think is found in about 30, 40 years of his writings in particular. But one of the things that's come up that the right here in the United States has become very good at in the last 5 years in particular, that has been, I think poses some challenge to kind of a municipalist orientation. And that is prefigurative and preventative policy making, right? And so about 4 or 5 years ago, after Cooperation Jackson came back from one of the cops, we did a report back, trying to educate our community, being accountable. Why do two people go halfway around the world when there's plenty of work and struggle to be done here? Why are we doing that? So we just announced it. Hey, we went to a COP. We're going to report back some of the ideas, lessons, reflections, and some of the things we think we want to bring home that we learned from various international struggles. The local Tea Party dominated. We got a little news coverage on one channel, and then within 2 weeks, this was in January, because the trip was in end of November. So we come back, we said we want to do this report in January. So it was after all the breaks and all that kind of stuff. They came up with the first kind of instance of, we're going to do some preventative policy construction and make a bill that the state of Mississippi would not adhere to any of the UN climate recommendations or adopt anything as policy. And there was even talk about having folks like us or anybody who was articulating something like that to have to register as agents of a foreign nation, right? And that part of it didn't happen. It didn't go anywhere. But just give us some indication of how these right-wing forces thought, and they put that in practice. And to counter the strength of the municipalist movement as we articulated, going back to the late 2000s, when we started to build momentum and won a few municipal elections. By like 2016, 17, they really started sharpening their knives and figuring out how to use this tool of preventative policy to cut off any of the routes and avenues that a municipalist movement might want to articulate and put in policy. Wow. So they went after, so far, in the last 4 or 5 years, they've gone after the Fight for 15, right? Something that we were also, very instrumental in. They passed a law saying that no municipality in the state of Mississippi can change, its municipal workers, without their being approved by the state.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And so it's just ways of just like, we're just gonna undercut anything the municipalities would do and totally just eviscerate any notion of democracy being practiced. So all we have now, if what they're working towards, like in the state of Mississippi, and Mississippi, I'm just again citing as a case example, because this is going on all throughout the Midwest and the South in particular. Basically, we are just what I call, they are just trying to reduce us to be administrative units of pain. Right? Like, y'all just, punish people, lock people up, and ensure contracts. Wow. That's the only thing a municipality or this particular unit of the government can do if they have their way.
Right.
So, how this is played out in the context of the work of like Cooperation Jackson, we haven't abandoned that principle, but we don't talk about it as much for strategic reasons, right? And so now a lot of our thinking in our practice really is, well, let's just do the things that we need to do, and then we'll ask for permission later, rather than giving them ammunition to say, all right, you guys have this idea, and before it even gains ground or strength and momentum, or you can do some major community education to enact it, we're going to block it. So then it puts us in us then doing it puts us in an automatic antagonism within the context of the law about something being illegal. We're trying to build strength now of saying, hey, we're going to institute all these different things. You know, folks, like, remember the Jackson Just Transition Plan. We haven't abandoned it, hasn't gone anywhere. But now we are at the phase in our growth and development where there are a number of different things that we can't institute by ourselves to a degree of scale, right? Not on a citywide level by any stretch of the imagination, but you know, we got enough capacity now we can do some strength of scale, and that, you know, I'm using all these business terms, so y'all forgive me, but we can have proof of concept now that we didn't have before.
So here's a question around that, because it seems to me that, I mean, there must be a history of fascism going after participatory budgeting, participatory policy making everywhere. But what is the organizing strategy, you know, to really, I mean, just moving forward with initiatives and really building, you know, popular support before such preemptive measures are taken, or?
Absolutely, that's the main route, right? And demonstrate in concept and in practice. This is what the People's Assembly can do.
Right.
This is what our autonomous organizing units can do.
Totally.
Right. This is what our emergency response and mutual aid work. This is what it can do in the service of community. And so then when we want to make things to like scale it up on a municipal level, then there's a proven, like, well, hey, this is already working, and if they want to block it, they can't block the people from exercising the right to share with each other, right, to make democratic choices in their community with each other about, you know, at least how we conduct things on a people-to-people level, individual level. So, you know, still a place of, you know, trying to exploit the contradictions that exist, knowing that they can't occupy any and all in every space, but also that if they make certain rules and they do certain points of engagement, it actually undermines their own logic around extraction. Because, you know, part of the piece we have to remember, they want to ensure, you know, all the factions of capital in one form or another, one ideology or another. The baseline is that they want to ensure the movement of goods. Right, and they have to ensure the movements of goods. Now they might want to constrain some of them to either deflate or inflate their value in terms of what's legal and not legal. But at the end of the day, they still want to get things to market and have, you know, some realization of profit from that market. That's a piece that we are thinking of becoming Ananda more adept at understanding through our work and figuring out how to exploit that contradiction and just make it like, okay, well, if y'all want to stop this, you know, you're stopping yourself from doing certain things if you frame it that way, right? And the exciting example of what I mean, so, you know, I think as most folks are well aware, Roe v. Wade, right, is probably gone, you know, by the end of this year. The Supreme Court is going to eviscerate that. U.S. Supreme Court. I don't see it survive. You know, they might chip away at it. They might, you know, eliminate all at once. It's still not clear what they're going to do. But we know it's been on their agenda to get rid of. And they've done 50 years of organizing to stack the Supreme Court to get the outcome that they want, and they're here now. But what the thing about this Texas law, and the case that's going to overthrow Roe v. Wade, ironically, comes from Mississippi. It comes from a challenge to an abortion clinic, which is 2 miles up the road from where I'm sitting right now, right? And folks that we know, we've been allies with, done some fence work, et cetera, and continue to do so, many of our members and allies. But the piece that I think was we're talking about learning, you know, under all these contexts. I really appreciate it. I'm not a great fan of, you know, the governor of California by any stretch of the imagination, but I appreciated how he called the contradiction around, you know, basically what Texas set up. I forgot to mention that. It's kind of one of its methods and strategies to kind of undermine and get rid of abortion was basically to create this old slave catch reenactment laws, right? That used to be on the books that got taken away. They brought that back. So there's not anything particularly new. It's just new in this particular era. And then in rather than focus on extracting runaway property, i.e., people, now like anybody who wants to provide support to anybody having an abortion, giving them money or driving them, you too can be targeted and criminalized and hunted down, and anybody can charge you with that. What I like what Gray Davis did was say, or not, it's not Gray Davis, who's the governor now? That's the old governor, Newsom, Gavin Newsom.
Newsom, yeah.
What Newsom did was say, okay, if that's the logic you're going to apply, we're going to go after the gun manufacturers for gun violence, applying the same logic. And it's now giving them pause, like, well, and they said that themselves, like in their first deliberations, like, well, if we do this, it opens up a can of worms, that do we ensure we want to do that? And I think part of our thing is learning how to see this next generation. I think we have to do as much as a better job of highlighting these kind of contradictions, and then figuring out, like you were saying, what are the strategies and tactics of direct action and intervention and all its layers and levels that we have to do, because we are going to have to we're going to have to disrupt the system in a major way. There is no way, I think, around that. And I think the sooner we all come to grips with that, I think we'll start building a movement that, like the title of the piece, that actually addresses the moment and not just kicking the can down the road, thinking that some other time and place we're going to resolve these contradictions.
Yeah, listening to you, Kali, this makes me actually leads my mind to thinking, okay, if we're preparing future cadre, our new generation of leaders and organizers to think strategically, of course, it's always applied, but thinking globally and acting locally. Where does internationalism allow us to understand colonial resource wars, and where we need to intervene locally, where we have the capacity? The internationalism is really about the share, along with the alignment, that sharing that's critical to understand where the banks are going next with their money, whether insurance companies or whoever it is we're following. But where can we then locally disrupt their chains of extraction, production, and so on and so forth, and their investments. But it's I wonder, because I think that's the one area where I was just I was looking at, like, where are we? Where is direct action targeting the money? And there is movement on that front. That's probably one of the most interesting areas on the front lines of blockades, especially on traditional indigenous territories, and calling out the banks has been that kind of and it seems almost very simplistic, but we have been able to scare away a lot of insurance companies. I just learned like some 27 insurance companies were scared away from the Coastal Gas Link, or that the Wet'suwet'en have crossing their lands, or some number like that. And it's like, that's significant to be able to go, okay, we can scare money off way here, and the voice of the people does, allows for real intervention to happen has global implications. And I think that's where I think being a bit more strategically informed through the internationalism that you're talking about is maybe how, and simultaneously looking at how we're investing more time on the kind of strategies you were talking about that are really the underpinning of municipal strategies of building base, building education, looking at the places where we can fight back, claim back, lands and lives and labor, but also before these preemptive measures come in, before the the slap suits and whatever have you that they're trying to kind of throw at us through their colonial legal frameworks and otherwise. But there is a challenge there, because, and I think it goes back to the Bezos dollars, that even when we're engaging in Build Back Better, Justice 40, which I think embodies a lot of those problematic investments, but also I guess there's a lot, on the line in terms of access to wages, healthcare, and others that people see some promise in there. But all of the federalist or top-down policy arenas are sometimes, we have to be very intentional as to how much time we invest in those spaces, and how much it's taking away from time where we need to be really training up our new thought leadership on the municipal and local level. Right. Because I think that's sometimes a contradiction we face. It's like I always have questioned this, like, what is the veracity of us showing up at the UN? And I do believe in contesting, all the fuckery, I could say, rather, for lack of better, that goes on there in the neoliberal, markets, processes. But it's really, I think, not being like right now, it's a state by state battle across the US in terms of the new, the billions of dollars of subsidies that Biden's throwing down. And the money is eventually actually going to come to the cities. And that's where we're going to be fighting the new steel that's going in the ground, the extension of the carbon pipelines between the CAFOs and the LNG plants and the landfill gas sites, the incinerators, and the whole. I mean, everyone's lining up that trough right now, from what I could tell, at least on the West Coast. And I imagine actually the big, where you are, is like the concentration. I've heard that there's 50 active or 50 or 60 active carbon capture and storage permits all across the Gulf Coast, and that's
they're lining up. They're lining up.
It's incredible. That's where I think, gosh, I mean, if we have to draw attention to some of our allies to say we need to throw down more organizers in the backyards of people, and the plastics industry, it's the most crazy, bizarre build out where the oil and gas profits are really, so much of them are currently being concentrated in the manufacture of more disposable plastics, right? While we have a new global compact, they have the audacity to come and say, actually, this is the one area of growth where the building trades are promised, way more jobs, for example. And so those are some of those frontiers. The one area I wanted to ask your opinion on for a while is this huge, well, it's what I think is the biggest divide in North American movements, and that divide, the racialized divide. Where do we build alignment between communities of color, environmental justice, and other frontline communities, and the white working class? And as you know, I've been sort of looking at how do we do that with the labor movement, the only organized, the largest body of white, working class folks that we need to lean into together with local just transition conversations. And the challenge, of course, is until the AFL-CIO is willing to cut their ties with the cops and the prison guards and the building trades and everyone who voted for Trump, they are a space, a political space that are heavily compromised. But on a local level, there's been a lot of shifts, apparently. I mean, and so I don't know what that means for organizing where you are. I mean, like in right to work states or places where the union base has yet to be built. I'm thinking of the days as like, is there an inspirational lesson from the days of the Rainbow Coalition for Revolutionary Solidarity that actually had, that tried to couple militant action with kind of, I'd call it regenerative, or a policy, or at least that there was some thought around what are our systems for community care and defense that are supported while we're aligning our struggle against the right.
Right. Ooh, I don't know if we're going to do that in a few
maybe
minutes.
Another show. Yeah.
But I do want to leave it open. So if you got a little bit more time, I do want to leave open to some questions. So if folks have any questions, please start putting them in the chat, and we can open up and have go for, if you got like maybe another 30 minutes, Ananda, go into that. But let me cite again like a case study, because I think those are most illustrative. And I'm gonna pick on Mr. Bezos again. The first successful organizing effort in one of their plants took place in Staten Island. I think it was a pretty, tremendous victory. Black, Latino, women-led organizing drive. Chris and some of the folks work with them in the context of some stuff around the People's Strike. I think, unfortunately, though, we're gonna run, and they are going to run real quick into some of the shortcomings of the old 19th, 20th century strategy around unionization. And why do I say that, right? They don't have a contract as of yet. And what I suspect is going to likely happen is that it'll be a little bit of a logistics nightmare in the short term for Amazon, but one that they could easily adjust to by just shutting down those fulfillment centers and just relocating over to Jersey, right? Starting a new plant where they basically just dissolve even the fundamental basis of having to negotiate in the contract. Now, why am I bringing this up in relative to an example? In Alabama, one of the not the first by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the more promising kind of early union drives that I think the one in Staten Island, in fact, kind of learned some critical lessons from, was here in Bessemer. We're down here in the South in Bessemer, Alabama. And something that we were loosely involved with, knew about, and supporting in different ways as it was building up. And it is my view, solely my own view, not an organizational view, but it was my view that there was a critical juncture in their organizing campaign where they wanted to bring in some additional resources, to kind of fortify their position, to support their organizing. And they reached out to several different of the established trade unions to do that, right? And the other part was like, we wanted to use some of their muscle, et cetera. And in part, sadly, like philanthropy, that money came in with some conditions, right? And it came in such a way that it reshaped how the organizing was being done and what the target and what the focus of it really was in many respects. Because I wasn't there, I'm not in the plant, so this is my own opinion from talking to folks and my view and things that we were trying to impart around the failure of the UAW's organizing effort at the Nissan Renault plant here in Canton, Mississippi, that they started focusing in on kind of winning a contract, but that de-emphasized how do you construct solidarity amongst the workers, right? So the contract became the focus rather than the solidarity, right? And the relationship building and people, feeling enough like, hey, we are experiencing similar conditions. How do we support each other in dealing with these conditions? And I don't mean just at the plant, but like within the overall community, where the labor is being drawn from, who's getting hired, who's not getting hired, and then dealing with the conditions, so the way a lot of the factories are now being set up, totally different than they were in the 20th century. So Bessemer, where that's out, it's kind of like, to a degree you can call it, it's like in the middle of nowhere. Canton, kind of like in the middle of nowhere, right? But they're just tied to older established infrastructure. In this case, the 55 freeway here in Mississippi, and then the 20 freeway in Bessemer, and really the Canton plant and the fulfillment plant that Amazon is trying to build here. If you look at the Bezos' strategy, a new strategy, with Bessemer, with this place that's now down in Jackson and some of the other stuff they're planning on doing, they're conquering the 20 corridor. That's basically what he's doing right now, right? And it's a good stretch of that where they're concentrating is just close enough to some major cities where you can exploit cheap labor, primarily of Black and Latino communities in Alabama and in Mississippi, but it's located in counties and municipalities that are white controlled, right? We have to find critical ways of intervening and doing the organizing work in those kind of white counties and municipalities to draw people in to do the solidarity, so we cut off this kind of level of white workers, and particularly kind of semi-rural workers, thinking that there's a benefit of development in their community from Amazon or companies like it coming in, that then acts as a barrier to solidarity with the primarily Black and Latino workers who would then actually fill out the ranks of those who are actually employed. So that's a level of strategy and thinking that I think around how are we going to build these particular sectors and address like the white working class, that I think there's a new level that we of exploration around bread and butter issues, to use that term, that we really got to think through, right? And that doesn't, is not a de-emphasis on a class reductionist argument. I would never make an argument like that, just so folks to be clear. But there are ways in which we have to think and be very clear about, hey man, look, you know, I may live in this urban environment, you may live in this kind of semi-rural environment, and they may on the surface be profoundly different, but there's a deprivation of resources in both of our communities. And the folks who own every goddamn thing, they deprive us both and play us both off each other. These are some things that we can do in certain fields to change our material reality. So we got to think about like parallel lines of kind of development and organizing in such a way, you know, that the left has to, let me put it this way, another way, and then stop. The left has to start developing serious, coherent strategies that are about placing rural and exurb communities in strategic alignment with the organizing initiatives in the urban spaces and urban conditions. Like, and so if we don't do that, we're not going to capture certain elements of kind of like the white working class that need to be captured. Because if you look at it, like most of the funding, the research, the political strategy, particularly around the Democrats, is they concentrate towards the urban areas because there's more density there. But in the United States framework, you know, in truth, land actually has more voting power than people, right? Just the nature of how things are proportioned out, particularly like on the presidential level with the electoral college. Land and who controls the politics of a particular land base, even if there's only a couple of thousand people in this particular county that people generally will kind of overlook. Like as it plays out on the congressional levels and the congressional maps and all that, that winds up being very important because we overlook those as the left and don't invest time and energy in reaching people out in the rural areas and in the suburbs. And if we're serious about building a broader working class unity and a political, you know, base that we know we need, we're going to have to develop our own urban and rural strategy and take that seriously.
Thanks, Kali. No, that's great. And I was actually, it actually somewhat answers in my mind Joe's question here in the chat about Indigenous knowledge leadership and how it is provides not only a critique but also a movement building framework for challenging, you know, state capitalist environmental exploitation, climate change, etc. I would contend, Joe, that it's actually it's an internationalist frame. Coming from India, I'd say the only two places where it isn't as directly relevant right now, I think it will be, are really China and the European Union. I mean, outside of Europe and China, because China is the only country at the UN that does not recognize the identity of thousands of indigenous nations that I mean, you know, as someone whose grandfather was part of the movement, you know, alongside Mao and others back in the day, I think there was a mistake made by the people's movement in that day to fall for an imperialist framework of Han Chinese, because the Han identity actually comes, that was a ruling class that you guys are all Han and serve us, you know, the Manchurian dynasty. I mean, it was a concept that was entrenched into the working class that we never shed in that movement. So that if that had happened, I think, and I blame it on Confucianism, we would have seen a different state of play in China today, and that we could have started building solidarity with. But everywhere else, I think indigenous knowledge is really about place-based guidance, pathways away, the guidance that the earth provides us to actually dismantle capitalism and build systems that are aligned with the natural systems we see ourselves a part of, right, wherever we are in the world. However, where it's interesting, what Kali was just saying is, I think where the movement that I got involved in organizing tree planters up here in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, our platform was, our first thing was like align with first Indigenous sovereignty, First Nations sovereignty, but then create community scale economies, like stop raw log exports wherever we could, stop the multinational corporate trade-off and extraction, and participation in global markets, plug those places and create space for community-based forestry. And it's interesting now, back in the day in the early 90s, it led to 9 pilot projects. Now the 100 community forests that are around here are all, the majority, I think 90 of the 100 or so, are co-owned with First Nations and communities, but that wasn't big enough. I mean, it was like the oil and gas sector, like killing the forest exports economy back in the day, ensured that 3 big multinationals still control 90% of the forested land base. So the community forest movement was kind of tokenized, but in that there probably lies hope. I mean, I think if we are to stop the fossil fuel economy as this time allows, the only place we actually can go to provide jobs for the settler communities here is in a value-added, localized, forest-based economy. And that's, I still think, I mean, even restoring natural ecosystems, I've estimated that you could probably deploy the entire United States Armed Forces to spend the next 10 years restoring wetlands, forests, and other natural ecosystems across the US, and there would still be a backlog of work to do. Right. But
can I just say something really quick? So I agree with that. I think that's a good point, and thanks for saying that. The question, I guess, just where it came from was a very something that happened recently to me, like a kind of a practical situation. So I live in Mexico, and I was, talking about this kind of thing to people from Mexico City that are Mexican people and speak Toronto, this kind of thing. And I was laughed at because they were like, you want to go back to, like Aztec kind of ideas of human sacrifice and an expanding empire, serious famine issues, and environmental exploitation. That's awful. Why would you want to use indigenous ideas pre-colonial? It's just what the Americans are talking about in their country. I mean, there's 25 million people that live in the Mexico City metro area. I mean, so that's where the traction things come from. You really have to be, and I still think you can give them the kind of internationalist framework that you're talking about, but just from a practical standpoint, it doesn't always, it backfired severely on me when I was talking about this. So that's why I bring it up as a specific kind of example.
One person whose ideas in this realm, I think, are worth studying. And if anybody, if you never heard of Amilcar Cabral, I would encourage you to read some of his works. Now, he was a general. I'll put it in the chat, his name.
I mean, you may hear that in a lot of, left intellectual circles in India too, but the fundamental, I mean, where I'd contest in those circles is that a lot of our own folks need to decolonize their minds of, our history, and where knowledge still lies amongst the poorest campesinos in the indigenous sections of Mexico, right? And so the movements that we align with down there in Chiapas and other places have really brought us the deepest critique of global trade agreements, because their fundamental knowledge base is still indigenous, right?
Yes, I'll put the name in there, and this idea of kind of return to the source, and it's the idea which says, we have to look at the contradictions inherent in development from the beginning, not just European intervention, into our lands, but just the contradictions of what came with the various forms of empire, even before the emergence of capitalism, right? And the negative aspects of that, and calling that out, because capitalism built on these earlier forms and earlier systems of oppression, and calling that out. And this notion that he's articulating around returning to the source is, we need to build on and remember the legacy of human knowledge that goes back, really a couple of thousands, if not millions of years, and how it enabled our ancestors to survive, often sometimes in tough terrains and tough environments, but to live within the limits within those environments, right? And saying that we're not going to go back to the way things were. That's not literally possible in many respects. But there's certain values and principles and practices that we can, learn from examining the past that we bring forward with the new understanding and then the kind of the new technologies and, humanity's, apparent ability to kind of manipulate the earth for kind of like these short-term things, turning things into plastic or creating nuclear energy. Like, we've developed a particular type of mastery of certain aspects of the physical world that can be a benefit, right? If applied, but we don't, one of the things that I would argue with like, like we're in terms of the actual development of civilization, that's not a word I like, but I'll use it here. We're like toddlers playing with nuclear tools. That's not a good recipe for survival, right? Like we've unleashed a set of forces that have always been around us that nature, employs, but we've been able to manipulate it and extract it from its context, right? And I always draw from, my concept of looking at this of, some of the newer sciences investigating and learning, like for instance, like how birds and their navigation systems are some of the basic elements of like quantum physics and quantum mechanics are inherent in those processes, right? And how much does everything else around us really depend upon that we don't know or we ignore because it doesn't fit within a particular logic, but our bodies are functioning in these particular ways, like with our circadian rhythms and things of that nature that, we think, okay, we can just work a midnight shift and it has no effect on us. So we can work in certain particular ways and it's not going to have any long-term impact on our health, or we can master it when your body is literally telling you from millions of years of evolution. And that's not actually how you best function. Right, and everything else about your health might be better for function to serve if you observe this, if you ate this way, if you stayed in tune with these cycles and seasons. So this is we don't want to me, I think some of the piece around like there's a politics around what is considered indigenous and what is not in any and every context, and I don't think it's a fallback to like just any person who's indigenous or any person who's Black just come up and say, well, I have a monopoly on what these concepts or what these terms mean. Like, no, how are they related to the collective history of the peoples that are involved and the positions and the arguments and things that they entail that have enabled us, to survive and thrive in different ways under these terms and these contexts, which have clearly been stacked against us, clearly repressive. But not only are we shining through, but we're pointing the way towards solutions of like, look, I go back to some of these stories, like for instance, in how true it is, in part to me actually doesn't matter, but there's an old story that's told like around New Orleans, and I've heard it said in many different places, like when the French colonizers came in and set up shop, at a little trading post, folks said, there's folks, I wouldn't do that if I was you, because it tends to flood. It tends to do some things that you don't, it looks cool now, but you wait a couple of months and it's going to be a living hell, if you're going to, set up shop there. And of course, didn't listen. It built there, kind of set it up anyway. And then what happens, centuries later, perpetual flood, perpetual things, all the things that folks were initially warned about continually happening. You have to build all these artificial systems that work against what the environment is actually, telling you should work and when it should work and how it should work, that you could have worked with or worked around in a different way, as opposed to trying to control it. And, with systems that are not going to last, require massive amount of infrastructure and extraction from other areas to sustain. Like that is not the people are talking about like what you had brought up, like the population dynamics, right? To a degree, this is new, but to another degree, it is actually not. Right, because it may be new in terms of sheer numbers of how many people on the planet, but if we look at the history of collapse of earlier civilizations, like every land has a carrying capacity. We know this already, right? And how do we live within that? And then what are the social systems that humans have to be involved with to live within that carrying capacity? Capitalism has taken us out of that dynamic because we're extracting from the entire globe now rather than from a local community. So there's a false way in which, it looks like all of this shit is being sustained, but like when this thing, collapses, if it collapses kind of its own free will, it's not going to be pretty at all, right? So that's why we got to get our shit together and ensure that it ends, but it doesn't end with collapse. It ends, with what we were calling, what how I use the term, a just transition, something that we have decided and come to a conclusion that this is needed and it needs to be done in such a way, where we've reorganized society to deal with all these contradictions.
There's a question there, Kali, that you should probably get to about the Roe versus Wade being overturned, but I wanted to just share with you on this last point you made, just transition. I just learned Jose is going to go speak at a conference in just transition up in Gwich'in territory that all the Native movement, some of our friends up there are organizing, and they're using a term for the conference, I think a Gwich'in term that translates into something like future memories of how our vision, our capacity to envision what that just transition pathway looks like is our depth of place-based knowledge, is the oldest place-based knowledge of collective memory that can guide us onto that path. But you should probably look at this question asked in the chat from Max.
Yeah, we're gonna have to definitely cut this off in 10 minutes. And this is a hour-long question to just even try to tackle. But what I will try to say, Max, is on the practical side of things, if they do a chip away strategy, municipalities will be limited in what they can do everywhere, I think uniformly in the United States on this question. States, however, can do some preemptive measures. And if I understand, Colorado right now, for example, is passing or trying to pass or in the process of passing things to fortify access to abortion and to enshrine that in state law. Now, I think all the states on the West Coast, let's just call it what it is, all the states on the West Coast and all the states up in the kind of the New England type area, the Eastern Seaboard area, need to be pushed sooner rather than later to re-enshrine all of these access rights and to create a fundamental contradiction in the states' rights law and application that would then have to be turned on its head. So the left, to a certain extent, has always been fearful around using certain kind of states' rights arguments for sound historical reasons. But if we leave that, particularly within the liberal dynamic of kind of bourgeois representation being the only concrete way in which democracy can be or should be practiced here, then it limits the actual practice in us calling the contradictions that I think most of us would be on. So I think there's a way in which we don't want to use, I wouldn't use that language of states' rights, but I think we need to push the envelope around the need to decentralize and relocalize power and decision-making. And that we can use some of the arguments that they've used without using their rhetoric to go after this. That's why I was saying, similar to what Gavin Newsom is doing, he flipped that on his head. Like, okay, if y'all gonna do that, I'm gonna use your same logic in maybe a slightly different arena, but with the same principles and logic that you would hear to go at a target I want to go after. I think we're going to have to do that, but I think the concrete piece around ensuring this access is making sure that Colorado, California, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Maine, Connecticut. I don't know about New Hampshire and Rhode Island, but there's a block of states which could confederate in a new way around we're going to protect certain kind of bourgeois rights and bourgeois laws. that I think the left needs to get in on the ground for and push that, because we can push a broader democratic agenda. So that's a short answer to, I think, how we can do this on a structural level. The answers to the other part of your question should not go on a video, because I think we're talking about the deeper set of practices and structures that, you know, a lot, folks in the women's movement employed for a greater part of the 20th century, well up into the 1970s, that we need to relearn those lessons. And folks need to be clear and serious about like how to do certain things in the safest and soundest method, understanding that it's going to be criminalized at some point. But we know that certain people are going to need access to it, and then not limit our thinking to what actually exists within the confines of the law is what we have to limit our imaginations to. We just have to be mindful about how do we actually exert our inherent human rights within the confine which denies them, that it gives us the maximum amount of protection.
One thing I'd add to that, Kali, I think there's an organizing strategy opportunity in the context of the pandemic. If anything, the pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of centralized healthcare, and of course, everything from the trade-related intellectual property rights and patents, that Gates and others are exerting on medicine and healthcare, down to where can we be most adaptive and change the structural paradigm of the control of money, the control that money has over medicine, but down to where can we contest and where can we shift to community-based healthcare, where there's a clear cost savings in the community level to how many doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers we turn to a new place-based care model, right? And then where we can see investments in elder care, if coupled with investments in childcare, can actually deliver more holistic closed-loop models, that are community-based, community-rooted, seek guidance from local place-based, experimentation, but where money needs to go. I mean, we're like, where can we actually shift any resources or investments? If the Justice 40 money had to go anywhere, I'd say community-based, health clinics and positions where, nurses unions and healthcare unions can lean into relocalizing their labor in ways that eventually can provide some safety, some guardrails against this other, crazy stuff that's happening in the policy sphere.
Right.
But
well, in the interest of time, I want to stop us here. I want to thank you all for sticking with us for this 2 hours. Definitely going to come bring Ananda back. And some of this we got to explore more deeply. So be prepared for that, Ananda. I think we touched the surface on a number of different things, and over the course of the next couple of months, I think some of the things that we're talking about will reveal themselves even more and give us more guidance on where we need to go. But want to thank you all for participating. Be back with us the end of June for another round and another session of our series around race and climate justice. And stay tuned. And everybody have a good evening, good weekend. Enjoy May Day.
thank you, Kali. Thank you all. Happy May Day, folks. Thanks, brother. I think
All
that
right.
was
Talk to you
that was fun.
soon. Oh yeah. All right. Take care.